And Kreider's law is the law of storage, which says that every 2 years, or every 18 months, that storage doubles for the same cost. So our ability to access data and our ability to analyze data increases exponentially as well. So if we like to think of it from a different perspective, artificial intelligence occurs at the confluence of 3 exponential curves, not one. And if we think of it in a different way, and we look at it from people and processing, people and connection, and experience and data, this gives us another way to view how we reform our businesses around this capability. And then if we look at it yet another lens, what we have is the ability to fundamentally change the core levers of quality, access, and cost. And if we look at it through this lens, we start to understand why these disruptive plays grow so fast, are so pervasive, and end up completely transforming industries. Our expectation of technology is that it's binary. We switch it on and we switch it off and it should work 100%. An important thing to understand about artificial intelligence is that it's not 100%, it's probabilistic, which means that it's just less wrong. As we increase our data and as we increase our capability to analyze it, we get better at our predictive outcomes. And that's we're seeing replicate in many industries. It's happening with speed and scale, and Brett alluded to it as well. And this speed and scale is very hard to understand from a human context. So this is the classic startup pitch line, which shows you their exponential growth curve for their revenue line. But then let's reframe this exponential curve back to the reality and look at camera sensors in market through history. If we look at those camera sensors, we'll see that that kind of fits and understands the growth that we see with cameras, etc. Driverless cars, our ability to absorb. But for us to really understand this graph, we actually have to understand it and look to the right of that graph where I'll put it to scale. This is how quickly that information set is growing. It is impossible for human beings to comprehend that rate of growth and speed. So what we're seeing with computers and deep learning, machine learning, we're starting to see very, very significant changes in our ability to understand outcomes at a very fine level. And it's also very important to understand timing. If you had entered the digital camera market at the beginning of that curve, you're obsolete in just a few years. But the question is, could you jump to one without the other? And I think that it's very important for financial institutions to go through this learning curve. And in fact, if we break it up into a very specific model, it's really about learning, venturing, and then capital. And that formula works whether it's regulatory engagement, whether it's insurance technology, whether it's fintech, or whether it's regtech. So we really need to examine the fundamentals and look at how we achieve quality, access, and cost. So for that, we need to take very much a fresh view, and we need to change our focus. If we understand what's going around us, we're seeing massive behavioral change, and again, Brett alluded to it. It looks like, Brett, that we collude on slides, but anyhow. But our behavior is definitely changing. In fact, if you were to actually use machine learning and analyze my speech today, you could determine from sound waves from your voice alone whether you're manic depressive, schizophrenic, diabetic, or have a heart condition. And these are the algorithms that we know today. We learned from algorithms on the things that we write when someone took in 70 years worth of Agatha Christie's books and digitized them. People developed algorithms that accurately mapped her departure into dementia. Now this, from an insurance or banking standpoint, I think is something that we have that sits within our data centers today, but we don't understand or use it. Our risks are changing, and they're changing quite dramatically. I'm an advisor to Veritas Genetics, which is the largest genomics company in the world. When they publish something to a customer on a Friday, they've now learnt by Monday an entirely new set of facts about that customer's biology. The speed and scale at which we're learning about what drives us as human beings, we worked out that we're actually just 3.2 billion base pairs of code. When we actually start understanding the implications of that, it completely changes our outlook on risk. Information is a direct substitute for risk, and yet we don't even use the assets we have within our financial institutions today to understand those risks. And our relationship with technology is changing, and it's changing dramatically. And so is our understanding of the customer. As Brett points out, would you really treat your customers like this, to have them sit down, when really there are far better methods to actually understand their identity, understand their needs, and to sell them things that are actually in their interest rather than necessarily what you're incented for from a behavioral standpoint. And as it's been highlighted, we're in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution. And I want to pause and take time to really assess what that means. If we have a look at automation, and we have a look at what Tesla's doing with driverless cars and trucks, etc., and it recently, last week, became the largest auto manufacturer in the US by passing Ford in valuation. We're seeing that it's really transforming industry. But the human cost of that means that millions of people will lose their jobs. Millions of drivers. So if you imagine that your loan portfolio in a bank is full of drivers, will they be able to pay their long-term commitments if that is their sole method of income? If we start having a look at what's happening in China manufacturing, and this is the benefit of robotics and the benefit of AI, Chinese factories are now, even at mid-sized levels, are replacing 90% of human workers with robots. Production increasing 250%, defects dropping by 80%. Who doesn't want that as a business outcome? And we're seeing very similar things. When we apply AI to non-performing loan portfolios, we're seeing improvements between 25 and 80%. We're seeing AIs far outperforming credit bureaus and actually making them fairly redundant and useless at national levels. These are the types of business outcomes we want, but if we want to drive that transformation inside our corporations, we really need to understand the human factor and how we take care of our workers and how we redeploy them to other productive uses. When we extrapolate, Carney, who's the governor of the Bank of England, came out and said that his expectation of impact on jobs in the UK was a loss over the next 10 to 15 years of 15 million jobs. If you extrapolate that number, that means 80 million in the US and 250 million jobs in China. Structurally, is our financial system ready for that? And these things are happening whether we like it or not. Technology is not going to stop because we're not ready. The people that take advantage of it will be able to move quickly and will have advantages in markets that others simply don't. So what we know is that this time is different. But again, to go back to history, we need to understand how different. Because this time, it's not like the Industrial Revolution where it's the low-skill wages that go. AI is starting to impact many types of jobs. It's replacing surgeons. In certain types of surgeries, robots are already outperforming the surgeons. So if you have a chance of 90% chance from a robot of getting treated and a 40% chance from a human, ultimately, where are you going to put your business? And particularly when the marginal cost of operation becomes fractional to the surgeon. The same goes for radiology. 2 weeks to outperform in terms of radiology assessment for an AI. And then if we look at risk management and actuaries, my company specializes in AI. We wrote a new algorithm for underwriting, which is outperforming our existing underwriting and actuaries by 25%. This in 2 weeks. If we have a look at legal, we're starting to see AI displacing lawyers. And for many of us, that's a really great thing. But it's starting, if you think of law, it's a logical outcome business. Our objective is to understand the law and to obtain it. And in most legal jurisdictions, there are binary outcomes in those. And AIs are better able to assess that impact than most lawyers, because simply we cannot keep up with the rate of technology change and information. It's impossible for humans to do it anymore. As a friend of mine, an ex-US intelligence guy said, he said, don't send in a person to do a machine's job. The day of people taking priority over some of these things is gone. So, in the context of time, we need to put this in terms of history. When we have a look in the 1990s, the US car industry produced about $250 billion worth of revenue in Detroit. If we fast forward that now, we're seeing a 10x change. We're seeing in Silicon Valley in 2014, $250 billion in revenues being produced, but with 1/10 as many people. And if we understand the impact of artificial intelligence, we're likely to see that go another 10x, if not 100x. And we're starting to see that that people requirement is dropping quite dramatically and significantly. So when we think about it from an implication from the financial system standpoint, the question is, are we ready? Do we understand how we utilize these tools? Do we understand how to regulate them? Do we understand what those technologies do? Whenever I talk to regulators or finance ministers or people, politicians, they will always talk about privacy and protection. So if you're getting better advice more accurately and at an extremely lower cost and giving you access to a financial system, the question is, which way do you go? And generally we find that politicians will not stand behind high prices. So quality, cost, and access becomes their primary drivers because it's politically sustainable. If you have a look at the insurance industry, what's happening with driverless cars, you take a search engine and an app, and you put them together, and what do you get? If you have a look at the human accident rate, it's about 1 in 1,000 for driving. Now, I presented to a board of a major German car manufacturer, and I presented exactly this. I said, okay, so if you're in driverless cars and you have a scenario where if I bothered to own the asset, I would drive my car to work, or it would drive me, and then I would, instead of parking it and having it sit there as an unproductive asset, I'd say, go and work with Uber and go and earn some money, and I'll get you when I need you. Then the utility of cars goes up to anything up to 80%. So I move from 3% utility, a 3% return, up to an 80% utilization of assets. So what happens to the car industry? And if you think about insurance, if you look at the red dot, the accident rate, even just that utility dramatically shrinks the industry. But that's not the end of the story. We know from sensors, if we take an existing proxy, which is the aviation industry, which is invested heavily in accident avoidance, that the accident rate isn't 1 in 1,000, because then we wouldn't fly. It's 1 in 4 million. So what happens to the insurance industry off the back of this change? If we have a look at investors like Warren Buffett, who said he wouldn't invest in technology because he doesn't understand it, he's investing very heavily in artificial intelligence now, and for good reason. So to understand this transformation, today is not really a robot revolution, but it's on the way. When we start thinking about how we utilize technology, we're still in the era of collaboration. And what we've discovered through research at DARPA, and this is John Seely Brown, who used to be an advisor to me, who's on the board of Amazon, and he was the original chief scientist at Park. He talks about in DARPA research, he says the idea of a hacker and a sniper. And basically, if we put this in chess terms, the best chess player in the world and the best AI still battle it out, but the AI kind of wins now. But an average hacker teaming up with an average chess player will beat both the best computer and the best individual every time. And so what we're learning, and this goes back to Metcalfe's law, is that these dissimilar networks, our brain and the way we think versus an AI, is dissimilar. And when you combine the power of those two, you actually get an increased outcome. It's exactly Metcalfe's law and the law of networks. So I think we live in a very interesting time, but this is definitely a transition, as we saw with the imaging graph. So the challenge is, from a corporation standpoint, how do we connect talent, technology, and customers? And this is really the challenge that sits within the heart of every major institution today. Because very simply, our platforms are changing. Our channels, our delivery assets, robotics is starting, as Brett pointed out again, to pervade the home, and it will pervade in ways that we can't imagine in the next few years. But those platforms are changing. Elon Musk is even working out how to wire our brain directly into AI to take advantage of it. Again, it seems like science fiction, but then so did this just a few years ago. So we're seeing this change happening with speed and scale that we're unprepared for. And when we think about intelligence today, intelligence needs to be embedded at the very core of our platform. It's no longer something that you tinker with at the side. It really must sit at the core of everything that we do. So the question I have for you is, would you ensure the status quo? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Monahan. 네, 스티브 모나한 책임자님 감사합니다.